and South Korea in the future?
I think that the question is whether I do see a global NATO, I happen to, but I think the question is whether it gets too big to function. And I think that one of the things that's out there that needs to be discussed is, and came up a little bit during the Libya issue, is whether it has to be all in, all out, and whether consensus is something that is going to be continued. The question is how to not have a multi-tiered NATO where you have some countries that are more important than others. And so these are governance issues that have to be discussed, which is one reason that we kind of saw the partnerships, and the only way I can describe it is the Lego model, is kind of to plug in various partnerships in different things, different campaigns, so that you don't complicate the decision-making aspect. I mean, what Australia has been doing is remarkable, and America's kind of, I can't say new. I mean, we have always, if I might say this, everybody is looking at what the U.S. is doing vis-a-vis the Pacific as if we had just invented the Pacific. I mean, the bottom line is the United States has been an Atlantic and a Pacific power forever. And so the bottom line is it is not, and I keep saying this, the administration keeps saying it, pivot is not a useful word. I mean, the bottom line is it is really looking at what America's responsibilities are, how to operate within a global world, and to be able to look in both directions. And again, to your initial question, it's not Europe versus Asia, it is part of a global look. So I personally think that NATO has to, at this stage, the partnerships are a very good way to have kind of a global capability that doesn't necessarily have to be just all inside the NATO decision-making mechanism.
Okay, Christina?
Hello, my name is Kristina Mikulova. I'm a Young Atlanticist from Slovakia. Madam Secretary, thank you for speaking with us today. Yeah. You said something very important, that Russia for NATO is not a threat anymore. Well, my question is, how exactly does Russia fit into the Lego model? Your whole presentation highlighted the importance of concepts, and I think the community of democracy is having trouble defining what Russia actually is. In some areas, it's a help, like in Afghanistan. In some areas, it's a hindrance, like in Syria. In some other areas, yet it's the other, like in parts of the post-Soviet space. So my question is, how does the new NATO reconceptualize its relationship with Russia to move forward? And a part of it is also, well, how do we actually translate it into an institutional framework that actually works? In that respect, I would ask, how do you assess the relative success or failure of the dual-track approach that is pursued by the current U.S. administration vis-a-vis Russia? I believe it was devised by Malcolm McCoy.
I think that this continues to be a major issue, mainly because Russia doesn't know what it is. And I think that the problem here is the following. When we were in office, we were asked to do something that had never been done before, which is, I happen to believe that the Soviet Union lost the Cold War, not that we won it. It is not just a semantic issue, but basically the system didn't work, and it completely fell apart. But when the Clinton administration came in, what we had set for ourselves as a task and was necessary was how to devolve the power of our major adversary in a way that was not like complete defeat, the kinds of lessons that we'd learned after World War I and World War II with Germany. So the bottom line was how to do this in a way. And we tried very hard in terms of respecting Russia and trying to bring Russia into a number of different the G8, a variety of different things. Well, as I mentioned, I did go talk to President Yeltsin. I signed the NATO-Russia Founding Act for the United States, and trying to figure out how to bring Russia into the system, and in fact had made quite clear that if Russia lived up to the various requirements for NATO membership, that it was not completely out of the realm of possibility, that something could happen. They were not particularly interested. The problem that we're dealing with now is that Russia does not know what it is. And I think that it itself, for its own identity purposes, feels that it has to often be highly nationalistic, and President Putin is an example of this. And the question is how to persuade Russia that they are better off as part of a system. And a lot of the issues has to go to the whole missile defense questions and persuading them that they're not against them. But some of it is internal to Russia. I know one of the things that I went in the 90s, before I went into the government, I was part of a survey activity that was going on throughout Europe, including Russia, and there were focus groups, and we sat with a focus group, and these ordinary people were so mortified about what had happened, and they said, we're just Bangladesh with missiles, we have nothing. And they knew that all of a sudden they had lost their great power status, and that, I think, is partially what is going on. The hard part, our group of experts, we did not go to consult the Russians in terms of the strategic concept, but we did feel it was important to have a dialogue with them. And at that time, their new military doctrine had basically said that the expansion of NATO was their biggest threat. And trying to persuade them that that's not so, I think, is an important part. I don't think it serves us in any shape or form to try to recreate Russia as the enemy. And I think the important part is to constantly keep trying to have that dialogue and trying to find the areas that we have in common. But I do think we're about to go through a difficult period because President Putin is trying to, reestablish himself in a number of different ways. So I do think that's a big challenge out there.
Madam Secretary, if I can just, sorry for cutting your line, but so how should you react to the Russian, let's say, threats? Because I mean, recently there is the response of Russia to the missile defense. Apparently, is to relocate the S-400 and probably locate the S-500 in the Kaliningrad Oblast. So, and then there is the reaction from the general staff of Russia that there is going to be a preemptive nuclear strike. So, how should NATO react to that kind of behavior?
Well, I think that the question is how not to fall into the trap of kind of reigniting any kind of Cold War activity with the Russians. I do think that it is worth having, I happen to, mainly because I'm involved in them, is track 2 discussions in terms of trying to figure out what kind of things can be agreed upon that follow up on New START, that some way to in fact begin to talk with responsible Russians about the fact that we are not threatening them and that we need their help in terms of dealing with what the real threats are in Iran. But I think we also have to understand that a great deal of this is internal Russian politics and a matter of their budget issues. And interestingly enough, the man that was the ambassador at NATO, Mr. Rogovin, is now playing some kind of a procurement. He's a deputy, I don't know what he is in the new government, but somebody that's kind of involved in procurement as well as governance. Yes. And so there are a lot of various aspects. So I think there is a problem out there. There's no question there's a problem. But what I believe we should be doing is trying to figure out how to solve it in a way that doesn't make it worse and does not kind of fall into the trap of those Russians, and there are Russians, who would very much like to, sometimes in order to do politics you need an enemy. And so that is what I think is going on, is the necessity for some people to recreate an enemy, and we don't need that.
Thank you. We still have time for a few questions, so Timothy?
Timothy Stafford from the United Kingdom. Madam Secretary, you mentioned the importance of Southeast Asia, so I'd welcome your comments on developments within Burma, and in particular what you think US foreign policy, what the priorities should be in the coming months and years.
I think that, it's very welcome what has happened in Burma. I think that Aung San Suu Kyi is one of the more remarkable people in the world. I'm privileged to know her and to consider myself a friend. More importantly, she considers me a friend. I do think that what is interesting, back on the toolbox, is that I'm the one that put sanctions on Burma. And the question is now how to use the removal or suspension of those sanctions as a catalyst for change. And what the United Kingdom and the U.S. has done is to say that we're suspending, which is very important. Suspending is different than lifting, because suspending allows, it leaves a certain amount of pressure on, and leaves the possibility, it's based on behavior. And so the question is how things progress in terms of evolution of democratic practices in Burma. It's a long way from that. I mean, the military, it has a certain number of seats within the parliament. Aung San Suu Kyi may be incredible, but she's not a miracle worker, and she's operating with a small group of people. And I think that it will be interesting to see the extent to which economic evolution in Burma will in fact lead to more creation of a vocal middle class. But it's a big step forward, and then the other part I hope is that Burma doesn't get involved in kind of in the middle of Indian-Chinese grander politics. I mean, it does have resources, but I do think that what the West is doing is a good step forward. The U.S. has just named a new ambassador there, Derek Mitchell, who's been very involved in all of it, and a lot of attention is being paid.
Good morning, Madam Secretary. My name is Seth Johnston. I'm a Young Atlanticist and also a Truman Scholar from Virginia. Thank you for speaking with us this morning. My question is about how NATO endures. You mentioned that NATO endures, but other military alliances created during the Cold War, such as CENTO and SEATO, do not. A number of our speakers throughout the summit have underscored the role of common values and interests among the alliance members as promoting its continued endurance after the Cold War and into the future. I wondered if you might comment on the role, if any, that the institutionalization of the alliance has had on its endurance. In other words, does the fact that NATO is not just a treaty-based military alliance, but also a complex international organization, does that fact play a role in the fact that it's endured so remarkably?
I think that because it isn't just a military alliance, I think that is a very important part. The political aspect of it is that membership in it requires that you be a democracy, that there be civilian control over the military, a whole host of, I think what you're referring to as institutionalization in many ways, is something that is very important. But, and I think this is an issue, I created a group of former foreign ministers. We are people that met together a lot during the war in Kosovo, and then what we have done is to stay in touch through the last 10 years, and we get together whenever it occurs to us and talk without our national positions. And one of the things that we're dealing with now is a general problem of lack of faith in institutions across the board. It's true nationally in countries, and it's true internationally. And there are real questions as to which ones work and why they work, or whether if they take everybody, their membership for granted, what happens. We just spent a lot of time on the United Nations. We are going to be continuing looking at the other organizations. I do think relevance is obviously the important part. And what the strategic concept was about, and what this summit is about, is the relevance of an organization that was set up for one purpose that's doing something else. And that's why I think all the questions that you have asked, all of you, beginning with your original one, is how can you get Europeans interested in some other part of the world, is something that we have to embed more in people's thinking. And what I'm troubled by that's going on these days is that it's a little bit of a repetition of the past, is that whenever there are economic problems, that people then kind of revert to themselves. And a rise of nationalism in everywhere, but in Europe, I think that is going on in individual countries. The sovereignty aspect, the trying to identify, which ethnic group is undermining the economic system, various aspects that I think are a threat to institutionalizing anything. And so I think we are in a very complex period. And I also do think the following thing. I on purpose said my history with NATO. I am old at this point. I am, although I hate to admit it, is that basically I grew up with NATO. The fact that you all exist is terrific, because I think the problem is there are not enough people who understand the role that NATO has played, but not just as a historical relic, but as what it can do in terms of uniting in a common purpose and common values. And I don't happen to believe that Europeans have completely different values from Asians. I've never gone for that. I think basically we are all the same, and that people want to be able to make decisions about their own lives and live in stable societies. And so the partnership is what's important. And so institutionalization and people your age understanding the importance of it is absolutely vital.
I think we ran out of time. Madam Secretary, thank you once again. I think we got your message. The Young Atlanticists, we have to make the security policy sexy once again.
That's true.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. Please join me.
Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Secretary.
Thank you very much. It's great. Thank you all very much. And thank you for doing what you do. Great. Okay.